Hello everyone, welcome. Starting from this video, we will start talking about Josekis related to the 3-4 point. This video is a brief introduction, a beginner's guide to the basics of the 3-4 point. So of course, this video is for beginners, but also for Q players who might have missed some of the basics here. And if you're a done player looking to teach beginners, hopefully you'll cover what I cover in this video. Because oftentimes, some of the basics are not covered when we teach beginners. So here on the left are what I'm going to cover in this hopefully short video. So the 3-4 point is one of two ways that are most recommended to occupy the corner, right? There's the start point, then there's the 3-4 point. But what is the difference? That's the first question we want to ask. Briefly, the difference is that the 3-4 point has slightly better control of the corner territory. Whereas the start point, as we saw earlier in this Josekis chapter, if you play the start point, then your opponent has the direct 3-3 invasion, which in many cases will result in your opponent taking the corner territory away from the start point. But no such move exists for the 3-4 point. If black plays here, then there is no way for white to immediately take over the corner territory. White can only play any of these approach moves, as we've briefly discussed earlier in this chapter, and also here on my channel, chapter 4, with some basic opening moves. As for the Josekis, stemming from the 3-4 point and the start point, those will get slightly more complicated. But overall, the 3-4 point has better control of the corner territory. But the disadvantage is that it has fewer options to sacrifice the corner territory for influence. So if you like playing for influence, the start point is probably for you. If you like grabbing territory early on in the game, then the 3-4 point will serve you better. At the end of the day, you have to find your own preference. So as a beginner, try out both positions, both the 3-4 points and the start points, and see which one you like better. And your preference might evolve. Personally, I really like playing the start point because I enjoy playing for influence and going on the attack, even though I might sacrifice territory early on in the game. Whereas other players, even very strong players, will prefer grabbing territory early on in the game and then trying to survive their opponent's attack later in the game. It really depends on your style. And there's no option that is definitively better than the other. Number 2, direction of play. These are very, very important questions for us to answer. So on each corner, there are 2 3-4 points, and usually we call them both 3-4 points. We're not going to distinguish between them, but they're still different, right? The position is different. And the way we talk about this difference is where this stone is facing. So if we place a stone here, then the direction in which it's facing is to the right, like this. Why is that? Because if we play an enclosing move, then it'll be any one of these 4 points, right, for black to enclose, which we've briefly discussed in chapter 4. And that is why the direction of this 3-4 point is facing to the right, because logically, if black wants to make an enclosing move, it'll play to the right of this point. So the direction, once again, depends on where black can play the enclosing move. So that's easy. That's easy. But the next one will be slightly harder to understand. And that is, after this enclosing move, what is the direction of play for black? And that is this question. What is the ideal setup if, let's say, white just totally ignores you? Is it to the upper side or is it to the left side? Think about it for a moment. The answer is the left side. This is where black wants to go next, after enclosing the corner. Why is that? Is it because the upper side seems a little smaller, it's only a 3-space extension, whereas this is a 5-space extension? No, it's actually not about how long this stone is extending. It is about an even more ideal setup, and that is for black to jump toward the center. So this whole setup, right, if we look at this, the whole idea is for black to build something 3-dimensional, rather than just protecting the side territory on the 4th or 3rd lines. If you play here, this is already the 5th line, whereas this stone or any of these stones will be on the 5th line or 6th line if you count from the left. So this is a very nice way, very ideal way for black to build something three-dimensionally. And that is your ideal setup. This is your ideal setup. If you can get to this pattern, of course your opponents will be playing elsewhere on the board as well. But this is a very, very good way for black to play, especially for beginners. This is something you need to keep in mind. Compare this to developing on the upper side after this extension. First of all, it is very easy for white to stem black's development on the upper side by playing the shoulder hit against the small knight's enclosure. Right. Similarly, if you play here on the 3rd line with a large knight's enclosure, it's just harder for black to play three-dimensionally, right? Because this stone is a little too low if you count from the upper side, right? But if you count from the left side, once again, this is on the 6th line already, and that's a good position. What about the 4th line move, right? Once again, the key move is on the left, not the right. You might be thinking this, right? This is a nice extension, but you're only guarding the side territory, whereas here, the next move, once again, will be here on the 5th line, and this is more three-dimensional. If you play here, white can also contest the upper side very easily by playing an approach move here on the 3rd line where there's attachment. Right? Similarly, if you play here, white can contest the upper side very easily. Whereas if you play here on the left side, then white can't really just invade here, right? White cannot attack black immediately, and white doesn't even have a 2-space extension. This will be too small of a base for white. So white can't really come in after you make this ideal setup. So that is the ideal setup that beginners need to keep in mind, right? You want to first get to the enclosure, and then if your opponent doesn't play on the left side here, you want to play right here, right? So if you can get to these 2 points after the 3-4 points, then this is a very, very good setup, especially for beginners and Q players to learn. Another thing for beginners to note is that even just after 4 moves, you will think everything is pretty standard, but there is one situation where 2, 3, 4 points are facing each other, right? We just talked about the direction of play. So this white stone is facing the right, whereas this black stone is facing the left. So we say these 2, 3, 4 points are facing each other. Normally, we would say when you have these 4 corners, you can play on any corner, right, wherever you want. But when you're facing each other, the approach to the other corner becomes very, very important, right? So this approach right here is more important than playing on any of these other corners, right? So that's something to keep in mind. A is more important than B, C, D, or E, or any of these other moves on these other corners, right? So that's something also to look out for, right? That's why you might see in some games, right, if black plays here and white leads with the 3-4 point. Now what can black do? Black can play a move that's facing this 3-4 point. And now white will most likely have to grab the corner, right? And now black has made this happen, and black can play an approach move right here in the lower left to take advantage of the 2, 3, 4 points facing each other. So black already gets a little bit of an advantage here by playing here, right? So that's something to watch out for if you're white. And in some games, I believe, when this happens, white might even play the approach first, even sacrificing an open corner. So black will probably want to get to the open corner because the open corner is always very big. And white, of course, can proceed here on the lower right. So that shows you how important this approach is when these 2, 3, 4 points are facing each other, because some players might be willing to sacrifice an open corner. So that is, again, something that does not get taught all that often, but I think it's something useful to point out to beginners and Q players. Lastly, let's look at a few examples to illustrate direction. Even though we say you can play wherever, right, when you're first starting out on the board like this, but it does make a difference, right? Sometimes when you start playing the 3, 4 points, if you play the start point, of course, there is no difference which direction you play. But when you play the 3-4 points, so number one, this is a very common setup, right? So number one, this black 3-4 point is facing white, right? It's facing white, and black wants to play a corner enclosure. Once again, it is very good for guarding the corner territory, for grabbing territory. So number 5 is a common move, right? And if white ignores black, then black's next move will be right here. This is the direction for black to play after the enclosure, right? So black will play right here at number 7 on the right side. This is the ideal setup. And to break this setup, you often see white coming to the right side like this, which is fine for beginners and cue players. If you're a stronger player, usually you would see this approach, right? Because we say, once again, that approaching the corners is usually more valuable than playing on the side. But of course, if you play here, then you might be worried that if you play a Joseki like this, then black at sente, and black can develop again, right? So that's why it's perfectly okay for beginners and cue players to split the side here with number 6, right? To prevent that ideal setup by black. Compare this, right, to right here. I know you might be thinking, why am I starting from an empty board again? Can I just change this stone? Because when you're starting a new game, it is more polite. It is good etiquette for black to play on its own upper right. So that's why I always start from the upper right when I'm showing you the beginning of a full game. So remember that. It's always considered polite for black to play on the upper right. So similarly, right, once again, this is a 3-4 point and a start point. But this 3-4 point is facing its own stone, right? This is facing number 3. And one thing you almost never see in professional games and high-level amateur games is black playing this corner enclosure, or any of these corner enclosures, when the 3-4 point is facing its own stone. Why is that? Why is that? Because the next very big move, very obvious move for white, will be here on the upper side. Why? Because, as we said, after this corner enclosure, black's direction is here on the left side. But now it is white's turn, and white will want to play here on the upper side, denying black the ideal setup. And it's very easy for white to play at number 6, right? Compared with the splitting the side. If white split the side, once again, just going back to this, let's see the difference. White is very far away from its own reinforcement, and white is not building any side territory. White will be pincered from both sides and potentially attacked later on in the game, right? So it's either this or something like this. But of course, white can, right? This will be perfectly fine beginner or cue game with white building a base here. But most likely, black will get sente and can play elsewhere, right? So this is very different than white's just building already on the upper side, right? And this is very different, very different, because white will not come under attack after playing number 6, and white has effectively denied black the ideal shape. So that is why you never see black number 5 playing the corner enclosure. Instead, we have what is called the Kobayashi opening, and that is black getting to the upper side first, and now hoping that white ignores it. Now black will get to the ideal shape here on the upper right and the upper side. And that is why usually after the Kobayashi opening, it is recommended that white play the approach immediately against this corner, right? Once again, the goal is to deny black the ideal setup. This is, once again, crowd favorites, I would say, 1 and 3, this setup, right? It's not facing each other. It's not in the same direction. But usually, if you want to make one enclosure, you make the enclosure at number 3, right? You almost never see this. You almost never see this because of the direction. Again, number 5, you're just leaving the really big point on the upper side to your opponent. Also, it is because, once again, even though this is not 2, 3, 4 points facing each other, but when you have number 3 facing the opponent, this approach is also quite important. It's also quite important, right? When it's facing each other, it is even more important, right? Because both sides can approach the other. But when one side has the start point can also approach this stone that's facing white in this situation. So number 6 is also considered bigger. And that is why when you have 1 and 3, and you want to make an enclosure, you almost always see number 5, right? Or of course, you might see something like this. But the idea, this is what we call a mini Chinese style opening, right? Because the Chinese style is this. We play something here on the side, right? It is never this, right? It's something on the side. And when you have a stone facing a start point, right? Sometimes you see things like this, or this. It'll be a mini Chinese style opening, but the idea, once again, is to prevent white from getting to the approach. So either this, something like this, or the corner enclosure will be more important. So to prevent having a stone facing your opponent, right, especially as black, right, because you can decide where to play. That's why you see 2, 3, 4 points facing each other in some games. Not that often. At least I would never play this. I always play the start point. But you see 1 and 3, right, facing each other. That's fine. That's totally fine. And you can go for the Kobayashi opening, right, if your opponent has a start point, right, or you can approach your opponent any way you like. So this is fine. If you play here, then the value of this approach by white is not as great as when black is facing white, right? This move has greater value. Lastly, something you almost never see, and that is, right, when white already played here, black can decide, and black almost never play this, right? Playing 2, 3, 4 points facing the opponent. You never see this. You almost never see this. Once again, when we teach beginners, we always say, you can play wherever you want. But if you look at all these games, people don't play this. Why? Once again, it is direction. That's what we're talking about in this video. You're leaving 2, 3, 4 points, right, facing your opponent. And that means no matter where you play, the next move will be an approach to a corner, right? Because this is just considered bigger because you're facing this way, right? This is a big point because, once again, the corner enclosure by the 3, 4 point is very, very good for surrounding territory. So that is why this approach is slightly more valuable. And as black in this situation, you do not want to leave 2 valuable moves to your opponent, right? Both approaches are valuable. You do not want to leave 2 because your opponent will get to at least 1, right? That's the whole idea here. You do not want to leave 2. That is why you almost never see 1 and 3 in any professional games or any high-level amateur games, because this is kind of a beginner's mistake. So to conclude, what are some common setups for black, right? With a star and the 3, 4 point, I think either is fine, but you do not play the enclosure when you're facing the star point, right? Usually it's the Chinese opening, something like this, which is good for beginners, right? Just playing on the side, controlling the side. You might see something like this as well. We can have the Kobayashi opening if your opponent has a start point here, right? So this is also a favorite. It used to be my favorite back in the days. And when you have a stone that's facing your opponent, right, you can consider playing an enclosure, right? This is a good setup. And most likely your opponent will have to split the side, right? Otherwise, this will get black to the ideal setup with a 3, 4 point. And when you play 2, 3, 4 points, you need to be a little more careful, right? So when you play this direction, then number 3, right, and the lower side is bigger because this is facing your opponent. When it's facing your opponent, it becomes more important. Number 1 is facing black itself. So it is less urgent to play on the upper right corner. When you play 2, 3, 4 points facing each other like this, this is okay, right? This is not as urgent because you're not that afraid of your opponent playing the approach. So of course, you can play this, but once again, your opponent will get to play on the side, So once again, you should probably consider playing on the lower side or the upper side first, right? Maybe a Kobayashi opening if your opponent is playing the start point, or if your opponent is playing the 3-4 point, then you should consider an approach. Lastly, just to repeat, you almost never play 2-3-4 points facing your opponent, because getting approached by the opponent when your 3-4 point is facing the opponent is too valuable, right? This is too valuable for white. If we play something like this, this is a fine Joseki for both sides, but in this situation, it's slightly better for white because white already has very strong control of the lower side. So that is why, once again, you almost never see number 1 and 3. Hopefully this is not too complicated, but this doesn't get taught enough, right? We just tell beginners, play the 3-4 points, and that's it. But that's not enough. We need to understand the direction of play, right? Remember the ideal setup and why it's important, right? Once again, you want to play 3-dimensionally with your ideal setup, right? Something like this. And on the 5th line or even the 6th lines here to develop toward the center rather than just grabbing the side territory. Once you remember the ideal setup, you remember the directions and why. After just 4 moves, there are already better 5th moves and worse 5th moves. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Good luck, and thank you for watching.